Denver, Colorado, March 12, 2009. A cold Thursday morning that would forever change the lives of the Blackwood family and shake a quiet suburban community to its core. The emergency call came in at 6:42 a.m. Vanessa Blackwood's voice trembled as she reported that her 8-month-old son, Tyler, was missing from his crib. Officers responded within minutes, arriving at the modest 2-story home on Maple Ridge Drive, where they found Vanessa distraught and her husband, Garrett, pacing anxiously in the living room. "We questioned both parents separately, which is standard procedure," recalled Detective James Harmon, who was among the first responders that morning. Mrs. Blackwood stated she had put Tyler to bed around 8:30 the previous evening. According to her account, she checked on him at approximately 11 p.m. before going to bed herself. Mr. Blackwood claimed he had arrived home from his warehouse job around midnight and peeked in on the baby before going to sleep. The nursery showed no signs of forced entry. The window was locked from the inside, and the baby monitor remained on, its green light still blinking steadily when officers entered the room. Tyler's favorite stuffed elephant remained in the crib, but the baby's light blue blanket was missing along with him. This detail would later become significant to investigators. By mid-morning, the quiet neighborhood had transformed into a hub of police activity. Officers conducted door-to-door interviews, while others searched nearby wooded areas and a small park 2 blocks away. Canine units were brought in but failed to pick up any trail. Neighbors expressed shock as news vans began to arrive, their satellite dishes extending skyward like mechanical trees growing from the roofs of their vehicles. "I've lived next door to the Blackwoods for 3 years," said neighbor Eleanor Winters. "They seemed like a normal young couple. I would see Vanessa walking with the stroller almost every afternoon. Nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary." As the initial investigation unfolded, inconsistencies in Garrett Blackwood's account began to emerge. Security footage from a gas station placed him leaving work at 10:30 p.m., not midnight as he had initially claimed. When confronted with this discrepancy, Garrett became defensive, explaining that he had gone for a drive to clear his head before returning home. This was the first of several contradictions that would raise red flags for investigators. The Blackwood home was processed as a potential crime scene. Forensic technicians collected samples, dusted for fingerprints, and photographed every room. The nursery received particular attention, with investigators removing sections of carpet and collecting fibers from the crib. Initial findings revealed nothing immediately suspicious: no blood evidence, no signs of struggle. By evening, the search had expanded to include dumpsters, drainage ditches, and abandoned properties within a 5-mile radius. Community volunteers joined law enforcement efforts, forming search parties that combed through nearby parks and wooded areas. Flyers with Tyler's photo, showing a chubby-cheeked infant with bright blue eyes and wispy blonde hair, began appearing throughout Denver. The first 48 hours are critical in missing persons cases, especially with infants, explained Lieutenant Sofia Rodriguez, who oversaw the investigation. "We deployed every available resource immediately. An Amber Alert was issued within hours of the report, and neighboring jurisdictions were notified." As investigators dug deeper into the Blackwoods' lives, they discovered that beneath the veneer of suburban normalcy lay a household under considerable strain. Financial records revealed mounting debt, with the family's savings account nearly depleted. Neighbors reported occasional arguments, though none recalled anything beyond what might be considered typical marital disagreements. "We learned that Garrett had recently been demoted at work due to attendance issues," Detective Harmon noted. His supervisor described him as increasingly unreliable in the months following Tyler's birth, often arriving late or calling in sick. 3 days into the investigation, police obtained Garrett's cell phone records, which showed a series of calls to his brother, Bryce Blackwood, in the hours before and after Tyler's disappearance. When questioned about these calls, Garrett claimed they were merely about a planned fishing trip. Bryce, who lived in Fort Collins about an hour away, corroborated this story when initially contacted by phone. Meanwhile, Vanessa Blackwood maintained a constant vigil at home, hoping her son would somehow be returned. Friends and family surrounded her, offering support as she made tearful pleas on local news stations. "Please, if anyone has my baby, just bring him back. He needs his special formula and his medication for reflux. He's just an innocent baby," she begged during one particularly emotional press conference a week after the disappearance. The investigation took another turn when detectives discovered that Garrett had recently increased the amount of life insurance coverage on all family members, including a $50,000 policy on Tyler that had been purchased just 2 months before the disappearance. While not uncommon for parents to insure their children, the timing raised additional questions. 2 weeks into the search, hope began to fade. The media coverage, initially intense, started to wane. The FBI, which had joined the investigation, deployed behavioral analysts who developed several theories about what might have happened to Tyler Blackwood. "We considered multiple scenarios," said former FBI analyst Dr. Eliza Montgomery. "These included abduction by a stranger, involvement by someone known to the family, or the possibility that one or both parents were directly involved. Statistics show that in cases of missing children under the age of 1, parental involvement is unfortunately common." As the 1-month mark approached, investigators executed another search warrant on the Blackwood home, this time bringing luminol to detect blood evidence that might not be visible to the naked eye. The chemical revealed nothing significant. Cadaver dogs were brought to search the property and surrounding areas, but also failed to alert to anything suspicious. The case hit a significant roadblock when Garrett Blackwood retained attorney Nathan Walsh, who instructed his client to cease cooperation with investigators. "My client has already provided hours of statements and has nothing further to add. The police clearly consider him a suspect despite having no evidence of wrongdoing, and continued questioning serves no purpose except to harass a grieving father," Walsh stated in a press release. By summer, the active investigation had slowed considerably. Detectives continued to follow up on tips, but none led to substantial developments. Vanessa, who had initially defended her husband, began to distance herself from Garrett as his behavior grew increasingly erratic. Friends reported that he alternated between periods of apparent indifference and sudden emotional outbursts. In September 2009, 6 months after Tyler's disappearance, the case received renewed attention when an anonymous caller claimed to have seen a man matching Garrett's description carrying what appeared to be a bundle down to Cherry Creek during the early morning hours of March 12th. Police divers searched relevant sections of the creek, but found nothing of evidentiary value. As the 1-year anniversary of Tyler's disappearance approached, the case had effectively gone cold. Investigators had interviewed over 200 people, followed up on more than 400 tips, and executed multiple search warrants. Yet Tyler Blackwood remained missing, his fate unknown. Without new evidence or credible leads, we were forced to scale back the active investigation, Lieutenant Rodriguez explained. But that doesn't mean we stopped looking. Missing children cases are never truly closed until resolved. In March 2010, exactly 1 year after Tyler vanished, the Denver Police Department officially classified the case as cold but active, meaning it would remain open but would no longer command dedicated daily resources. For the detectives who had poured countless hours into the search, this was a difficult but necessary decision. Vanessa Blackwood, refusing to give up hope, established the Tyler's Light Foundation, dedicated to keeping her son's case in the public eye and assisting other families of missing children. She organized annual candlelight vigils on the anniversary of his disappearance, ensuring that Denver would not forget about the blue-eyed baby who had vanished without a trace. What no one knew then was that the truth about what happened to Tyler Blackwood lay buried, not just in secrets kept by those closest to him, but in evidence that had been overlooked during the initial investigation, evidence that would remain hidden for nearly 7 more years before finally coming to light. As for Garrett Blackwood, he would soon face his own personal downward spiral, one that would eventually crack the wall of silence surrounding his son's disappearance. But in the spring of 2010, as the case file was placed into storage, justice for Tyler seemed increasingly unlikely. The system had failed to find answers, and a grieving mother was left to wonder if she would ever know what happened to her child. Little did anyone suspect that the key to unlocking the truth had been there all along, waiting for someone persistent enough to discover it. As the first light of 2010 dawned on Denver, the case of Tyler Blackwood had joined the ranks of over 1,800 missing children cases across Colorado. The investigation, once bustling with activity and urgency, had slowed to occasional review sessions and follow-ups on sporadic tips that invariably led nowhere. Detective James Harmon kept a photo of Tyler on his desk, a reminder of unfinished business. "Some cases get under your skin," he would later tell reporters. The Blackwood case wasn't just about a missing child. There was something about the circumstances that never added up. While the public-facing investigation had cooled, behind the scenes, detectives continued to build a profile of Garrett Blackwood. Financial records painted a picture of a man drowning in debt, Credit card statements revealed numerous cash advances in the months before Tyler's disappearance. Bank records showed their mortgage was 3 months behind, and Garrett had recently been denied a loan consolidation. Financial pressure is often a catalyst for desperate actions, explained forensic psychologist Dr. Natalie Chen, who consulted on the case. When we examined Garrett's history, we saw classic signs of someone spiraling under mounting pressure: increased alcohol purchases, gambling activity, and erratic spending patterns. In April 2010, investigators received permission to conduct a more thorough examination of Garrett's work computer, which had been initially reviewed during the first days of the investigation. Digital forensics specialist Marcus Weller discovered search history that had been superficially deleted but remained recoverable. The searches were concerning, Weller noted in his report. In the weeks before Tyler's disappearance, Garrett had researched topics including accidental infant death legal consequences, how to tell if a body will float, and undetectable poisons. While not conclusive evidence of wrongdoing, these searches certainly raised additional red flags. When confronted with this information, Garrett's attorney dismissed the searches as a grieving father looking for answers about what might have happened to his son. "My client works in pharmaceuticals logistics. The searches about substances were related to his job," attorney Nathan Walsh claimed. As for the other searches, Mr. Blackwood was desperately trying to understand what might have happened to Tyler, considering all possibilities. This explanation satisfied no one in law enforcement, but without physical evidence linking Garrett to a crime, prosecutors were hesitant to move forward. The district attorney's office reviewed the case file, but determined there wasn't sufficient evidence to bring charges. Meanwhile, the Blackwood marriage had disintegrated under the strain. Vanessa filed for divorce in August 2010, citing irreconcilable differences. Court documents revealed her growing suspicion that Garrett knew more than he had shared about their son's disappearance. During the divorce proceedings, Vanessa testified that Garrett's behavior had changed dramatically in the weeks after Tyler vanished, recalled family court clerk Teresa Jimenez. She described him waking from nightmares, shouting about the creek and what's done is done. First, when she questioned him about these outbursts, he would become defensive and accusatory. The divorce was finalized in early 2011, with Vanessa receiving the family home as part of the settlement. Garrett moved into an apartment across town and began working at a different pharmaceutical distribution center. For a time, he seemed to fade into obscurity, emerging only for the occasional interview when reporters did anniversary stories about Tyler's disappearance. "He became a ghost," said Lieutenant Rodriguez. "He'd show up for scheduled interviews, give the same rehearsed answers about wanting closure, then disappear back into his life. It was as if he'd constructed a new identity, one that acknowledged his missing son as a historical fact, but showed little emotional connection to that reality." Throughout 2011 and 2012, investigators continued to receive occasional tips about Tyler's case, particularly around the anniversary of his disappearance, when media coverage would briefly resurface. None proved substantial enough to reactivate the full investigation. In late 2012, a potential break emerged when a prison inmate claimed his cellmate had confessed to abducting Tyler. Detectives spent weeks pursuing this lead, only to discover it was fabricated in hopes of receiving a reduced sentence. This pattern of false leads and dead ends became dishearteningly familiar to the investigators, who remained connected to the case. By 2013, public interest had waned considerably. The annual vigils organized by Vanessa through the Tyler's Light Foundation saw declining attendance. Local media covered the story less frequently. Only Vanessa's unwavering determination kept Tyler's memory alive in the public consciousness. "I made a promise to my son," she told a reporter on the 4th anniversary of his disappearance. "I promised I would never stop looking for him, never stop fighting for the truth, no matter how long it takes." Behind the scenes, the case file continued to grow. Every tip, interview, and piece of evidence was meticulously documented, creating a comprehensive record that would eventually span thousands of pages. This thoroughness, standard procedure in missing persons cases, would later prove crucial when fresh eyes reviewed the investigation. In early 2014, Garrett Blackwood's life took another downward turn when he was arrested for driving under the influence. His blood alcohol level was nearly 3 times the legal limit. During processing, he reportedly became emotional, telling the arresting officer, "You don't understand the weight I carry. You have no idea what it's like to live with what I've done." When questioned about this statement the following day, Garrett claimed he was referring to his failure as a father to protect his son. The officer noted the comment in his report, but, unaware of Garrett's history, didn't immediately connect it to the missing child case. Later that year, Denver Police Department underwent a significant reorganization. As part of this restructuring, a dedicated cold case unit was established with increased funding and resources. Lieutenant Rodriguez, now promoted to captain, ensured that Tyler Blackwood's case was included in the unit's priority list. Cold cases require fresh perspectives, Captain Rodriguez explained. Sometimes investigators who've been with a case from the beginning develop tunnel vision. New detectives might see patterns or connections that were previously overlooked. In December 2014, Detective Meredith Sutton was assigned to the cold case unit after a distinguished decade working homicides. Known for her methodical approach and unwavering persistence, Sutton requested Tyler's case specifically after reading about it during her orientation. What struck me immediately was the incongruity between the evidence and the lack of resolution, Sutton would later testify. Here was a case with a clear person of interest, numerous suspicious circumstances, and yet no definitive action had been taken. I believed we could do better. As 2015 began, Sutton immersed herself in the case files, reading every interview transcript, reviewing all evidence logs, and studying the timeline meticulously constructed by the original investigators. She approached the case with fresh eyes, but built upon the foundation laid by Harmon and his team. One of Sutton's first actions was to re-interview key witnesses, beginning with neighbors who had been present during the initial days of the investigation. This decision, seemingly routine, would eventually lead to a crucial discovery that had been overlooked years earlier. Eleanor Winters, the Blackwoods' former neighbor, had moved to Arizona but agreed to a phone interview. During their conversation, she mentioned something that hadn't appeared prominently in the original interview notes, a brief observation of Garrett's brother, Bryce, arriving at the Blackwood home very late the night before Tyler was reported missing. "I remember because it was unusual," Winters explained. "I was up late with insomnia, and I saw headlights in the Blackwoods' driveway around 1:30 a.m. I recognized Bryce's truck. It had those distinctive running lights along the side. He was only there for maybe 20 minutes, then left. I didn't think much of it at the time, with everything that happened the next day." This information contradicted statements from both Garrett and Bryce, who had claimed they hadn't seen each other in person that week. More importantly, it placed Bryce at the scene hours before Tyler was reported missing, a potentially critical piece of information that had been mentioned, but not thoroughly investigated years earlier. As Detective Sutton dug deeper into the relationship between the Blackwood brothers, she discovered that Bryce had sold his distinctive truck just days after Tyler's disappearance. Another detail that had been noted but not pursued aggressively in the original investigation. The cold case that had lain dormant for nearly 6 years was beginning to thaw. New forensic technologies, unavailable during the original investigation, offered potential avenues for discovery. And Detective Sutton's methodical review was identifying overlooked connections that might finally lead to the truth about what happened to Tyler Blackwood. As 2015 progressed, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to shift. What no one yet realized was that the wall of silence surrounding Tyler's disappearance was built on a foundation of fraternal loyalty, a foundation that was beginning to crack under the weight of renewed scrutiny and the corrosive effect of time on carefully constructed lies. The bitter Colorado winter of 2015 mirrored the cold reality of Tyler Blackwood's case. 6 years had passed since the infant vanished, leaving behind questions that seemed frozen in time. For Vanessa Blackwood, each passing year deepened the hollow ache of uncertainty that had become her constant companion. "The not knowing is what destroys you," Vanessa confided during a rare interview marking the 6th anniversary of Tyler's disappearance. "I've imagined every possible scenario. Some days I convince myself he's alive somewhere, being raised by someone who wanted a child. Other days..." Her voice trailed off, unable to articulate the darker possibilities that haunted her nights. While public interest in the case had waned, Vanessa remained steadfast in her commitment to keeping Tyler's memory alive. The Tyler's Light Foundation had expanded its mission, now offering support services to families of missing children across Colorado. Each year on March 12th, she organized a remembrance walk that wound through the neighborhood where Tyler had last been seen, ending at the small park where search parties had once gathered with hope that diminished with each passing hour. "I won't let him be forgotten," she insisted, "not by the community, not by the police and certainly not by whoever knows what happened to him. Detective Meredith Sutton had taken these words to heart. Since being assigned to the case in late 2014, she had methodically reconstructed the investigation from the ground up. Her office walls were covered with timeline charts, relationship maps, and key evidence photographs. Colleagues in the cold case unit had taken to calling it Tyler's room. Sutton approached cold cases differently than most detectives, explained Captain Rodriguez. Where others might look for the one big break that would crack a case wide open, she focused on identifying small inconsistencies that, when viewed collectively, revealed patterns of deception. By spring 2015, Sutton had compiled a comprehensive list of discrepancies in the statements provided by Garrett and Bryce Blackwood over the years. The brothers' accounts of their whereabouts and communications on the night of Tyler's disappearance had subtle but significant variations each time they were interviewed. It wasn't just that their stories changed, Sutton noted in her case journal. It was how they changed, always in response to new evidence or questions they hadn't anticipated. They were continually adjusting their narrative rather than simply recounting events. A critical development came in May when Sutton secured permission to apply new DNA technology to evidence that had been collected during the initial investigation. Advances in touch DNA analysis now allowed for the detection of genetic material on items that had previously tested negative. Among these items was Tyler's crib sheet, which had been collected and preserved in the evidence locker since 2009. The new analysis detected a mixture of DNA, primarily Tyler's, as expected, but also partial profiles from both parents and, surprisingly, a fourth contributor whose profile was consistent with a familial match to the Blackwood line. The presence of Bryce Blackwood's DNA on the crib sheet wasn't conclusive evidence of wrongdoing, clarified forensic scientist Dr. Lisa Parker. He could have visited the home and handled the baby at some point. What made it significant was that both brothers had consistently denied that Bryce had ever been in Tyler's nursery. Armed with this information, Sutton requested permission to re-interview both brothers. Garrett, now working as a pharmaceutical delivery driver and living in a small apartment on Denver's west side, initially refused through his attorney. Bryce, however, who had since moved to Cheyenne, Wyoming, agreed to meet with investigators. The interview took place in July 2015 at the Laramie County Sheriff's Office. Bryce maintained his composure throughout most of the 4-hour session, sticking to his original story that he had not visited his brother's home around the time of Tyler's disappearance. When confronted with the DNA evidence, he suggested he might have visited weeks earlier and perhaps touched the baby's bedding then. What struck me during that interview wasn't what Bryce said, but what his body language revealed, recalled Detective Sutton. When we showed him phone records indicating multiple calls between him and Garrett in the early morning hours of March 12, 2009, his entire demeanor changed. He became defensive, his responses more calculated. He was a man guarding a secret. While the interview yielded no confession, it provided valuable insights into the brothers' relationship dynamics. Bryce repeatedly emphasized his loyalty to family and made several references to carrying burdens for others. To Sutton, trained in interview analysis, these statements suggested knowledge he was actively suppressing. Following this interview, Sutton took an unusual step. Rather than immediately pursuing Garrett, she began investigating Bryce's life in the months following Tyler's disappearance. This decision would prove pivotal to the case. We discovered that Bryce had sold his truck for well below market value just 4 days after Tyler vanished, said financial investigator Marcus Pierce, who assisted with the cold case review. He then took an unexpected 2-week leave from his job, citing family emergency. Credit card records show he purchased camping equipment and supplies, consistent with an extended stay in a remote location. By late summer 2015, Sutton had assembled enough circumstantial evidence to justify a more aggressive approach with Garrett Blackwood. Working with the district attorney's office, she prepared for what would likely be their final opportunity to extract the truth. Meanwhile, Vanessa had rebuilt her life with remarkable resilience. She had returned to nursing, specializing in pediatric care, and had recently become engaged to a fellow healthcare worker who had volunteered with her foundation. Yet, beneath this reconstructed normalcy lay an unwavering determination to find answers. She called me every month like clockwork, Sutton remembered. Never demanding, never emotional, just asking for updates in that steady voice nurses develop. I couldn't give her the answers she deserved, not yet, but I could promise her I wasn't giving up. In September 2015, a potential breakthrough emerged from an unexpected source. A former colleague of Garrett's from the pharmaceutical warehouse contacted police after seeing a rerun of a documentary about Tyler's case. The man, Philip Lancaster, reported that in the weeks following Tyler's disappearance, Garrett had made a disturbing comment during a smoke break. "We were talking about our kids and I mentioned how exhausting my newborn was," Lancaster stated in his deposition. Garrett got this strange look and said something like, "Sometimes the easiest solution is the one you can't take back." When I asked what he meant, he shut down completely and walked away. And I didn't think much of it then, but after seeing that show, it's been eating at me. As fall turned to winter, Sutton continued building her case methodically. She re-interviewed Garrett's former neighbors, his ex-co-workers, and even his current girlfriend, slowly assembling a psychological profile of a man living under the weight of a terrible secret. There was a pattern to Garrett's relationships, noted Dr. Chen, who continued consulting on the case. Initial charm and engagement, followed by emotional withdrawal and eventually self-sabotage, classic behaviors of someone carrying unresolved guilt. By December 2015, Sutton had compiled enough evidence to justify another search warrant for both brothers' current residences and vehicles. The searches yielded no physical evidence directly tied to Tyler's disappearance, but investigators discovered something unexpected in Bryce's garage: the distinctive custom running lights that had once adorned his truck, carefully preserved in their original packaging. "Who keeps lights from a vehicle they sold 6 years ago?" Sutton questioned in her case notes. "Someone who knows those lights might be identifiable by witnesses and wants to ensure they're never reinstalled on another vehicle." As 2015 drew to a close, the investigation had progressed significantly, but still lacked the definitive evidence needed for an arrest. Sutton requested and received approval to conduct a more thorough review of the brothers' communications around the time of Tyler's disappearance. This decision would prove to be the turning point. While phone records from 2009 had been examined during the original investigation, technology now allowed for more detailed analysis of cell tower data, providing a clearer picture of both brothers' movements on that fateful night. "The cell tower analysis was like turning on a light in a dark room," explained digital forensics expert Ethan Wong. "Suddenly, we could see that both brothers' phones had pinged off towers in a sequential pattern, leading from the Blackwood residence toward the mountains west of Denver between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. on March 12, 2009. This directly contradicted their statements about staying home that night. As January 2016 arrived, Detective Sutton prepared to confront both brothers with this new evidence. After years of silence, the truth about what happened to Tyler Blackwood was finally within reach. The wall of secrecy the brothers had built was about to crumble, bringing with it the answers that Vanessa and the community had sought for nearly 7 years. What no one yet realized was that the tragedy of Tyler Blackwood's disappearance was even more complex than they had imagined, a web of panic, poor decisions, and misplaced loyalty that had devastated multiple lives and would soon shatter whatever peace Garrett and Bryce had managed to construct in the aftermath of that March night. January 2016 arrived with an Arctic blast that sent temperatures plummeting across Colorado. As Denver residents bundled against the cold, Detective Meredith Sutton sat in her office, surrounded by 7 years' worth of evidence in the Tyler Blackwood case. The new cell tower analysis had provided the momentum she needed to approach the district attorney about intensifying the investigation. "We're at a critical juncture," Sutton explained during a briefing with the prosecution team. The cell tower data places both brothers traveling westward from Denver toward the mountains during the exact time frame when Tyler allegedly disappeared from his crib. This directly contradicts statements they've maintained for years. District Attorney Caroline Mendez reviewed the evidence carefully before giving her assessment. "It's compelling but still circumstantial. What we need is something that breaks one of them, preferably Bryce. He has less at stake and seems more likely to crack under pressure." The strategy they developed was methodical. Rather than confronting the brothers simultaneously, they would focus first on building a case against Bryce as an accessory after the fact. This approach offered both legal leverage and psychological pressure that might fracture the brothers' united front. On January 18, 2016, Sutton and her team began a deep dive into Bryce Blackwood's financial records from 2009. They discovered something they had missed previously: a cash withdrawal of $4,200 from his savings account the day after Tyler's disappearance, followed by the closure of the account 2 weeks later. The timing is significant, noted financial investigator Pierce. Combined with selling his truck below market value days after the disappearance, we're seeing a pattern of liquidating assets quickly. These are actions consistent with someone preparing to flee or disappear if necessary. While investigators built their case against Bryce, they also reached out to Vanessa Blackwood to request another review of items that had been returned to her from the nursery. Though initially reluctant to revisit these painful reminders, Vanessa agreed when Sutton explained they were looking for any connection to Bryce that might have been overlooked. "I'd packed everything away," Vanessa later recalled. "It was too painful to look at Tyler's things, but I couldn't bear to part with them either. They were in storage containers in my attic, untouched for years." This review yielded an unexpected discovery. Among Tyler's belongings was a small stuffed fox that Vanessa identified as a gift from Bryce. The toy hadn't been mentioned in the original inventory of nursery items because it had been found wedged behind the changing table during the home's renovation years after the investigation. What made this significant was Bryce's repeated claim that he had never given Tyler any gifts and had minimal interaction with his nephew. Armed with these new inconsistencies, Sutton obtained permission to place Bryce under surveillance in late January. Investigators monitoring his activities in Wyoming noted that he made a monthly trip to a remote area in Medicine Bow National Forest, always alone, regardless of weather conditions. "It struck us as ritual behavior," explained behavioral analyst Dr. Montgomery, who had rejoined the investigation. "Regular visits to a specific location, particularly in isolation, can indicate a site of significance, possibly connected to guilt, remembrance, or evidence concealment." By early February, the investigation had gathered sufficient momentum that Captain Rodriguez authorized additional resources, including surveillance of Garrett Blackwood as well. Observers noted that the brothers, while living in different states, spoke by phone every Sunday evening, calls that typically lasted less than 5 minutes and occurred at precisely 8:30 p.m. The regularity and brevity suggested check-ins rather than normal brotherly communication, Sutton noted in her case file. It had the hallmarks of an established protocol rather than natural conversation. The breakthrough they had been waiting for came on February 12, 2016, when digital forensics completed recovery of deleted text messages from an old phone of Garrett's that had been collected during the original investigation, but never fully analyzed due to technological limitations at the time. Among the recovered messages was an exchange between the brothers from March 12, 2009 at 1:42 a.m. Garrett: "Need you now. Emergency. Come alone. Bryce: "What's wrong?" Garrett: "Just come. No phone. Too important." Bryce: "30 minutes." This exchange directly contradicted both brothers' statements that they had not communicated that night beyond a brief call about a planned fishing trip. More importantly, it established clear evidence of urgency and secrecy hours before Tyler was reported missing. "This was the first concrete evidence of deception we could present to a judge," District Attorney Mendez explained. "It allowed us to obtain more aggressive search warrants, including one for Bryce's regular destination in Medicine Bow National Forest." On February 20, 2016, a team including Sutton, forensic specialists, and local Wyoming authorities converged on the location Bryce had been visiting. The area was a remote clearing approximately 2 miles from the nearest forest road, accessible only by a narrow hiking trail. Nothing immediately visible indicated why this spot held significance. "We were about to conclude our initial sweep when the cadaver dogs alerted near a large boulder at the clearing's edge," recalled forensic technician Jamal Washington. "The ground showed no obvious signs of disturbance, but the dogs were insistent. Ground-penetrating radar revealed nothing definitive, but soil samples taken from around the boulder showed trace evidence of lime, a substance often used to accelerate decomposition and mask odors. While this finding wasn't conclusive enough to justify excavation of a protected forest area, it provided valuable leverage for the next phase of the investigation. With mounting evidence of the brothers' deception, Sutton secured approval for a strategic approach to questioning. Rather than confronting Garrett directly, she would use the evidence against Bryce to pressure him into cooperation. On March 3, 2016, investigators approached Bryce outside his workplace in Cheyenne. Instead of requesting an interview, Sutton presented him with a formal letter outlining the evidence they had gathered: the cell tower data, the financial records, the recovered text messages, and the findings at the forest location. The letter concluded with a stark choice: cooperate within 72 hours or face arrest as an accessory to kidnapping and potential homicide charges. His reaction told us everything, Sutton recalled. He didn't express outrage or confusion. He simply asked, "What exactly do you want from me?" It was the response of someone who had been waiting for this moment for 7 years. Bryce requested 48 hours to consult with an attorney. Investigators maintained surveillance as he visited a local law firm the following day, then drove to his home where he remained for several hours. That evening, his phone showed a call to Garrett, lasting nearly 30 minutes, the longest communication between the brothers in months. The following morning, March 5th, Bryce's attorney contacted Sutton to arrange a formal interview with prosecutors present. In exchange for consideration in charging decisions, Bryce was prepared to provide a complete statement regarding the events of March 11-12, 2009. "We were cautiously optimistic," District Attorney Mendez said. "Witness cooperation after years of silence can sometimes yield limited information, just enough to protect themselves while minimizing their own culpability. We needed to ensure we got the full truth." The interview was scheduled for March 7th at the District Attorney's office in Denver. As the appointed time approached, the investigative team prepared for what might finally reveal Tyler Blackwood's fate. Vanessa was notified that significant developments were expected, but was asked to maintain distance from the proceedings to avoid any complications. "Those 2 days of waiting were almost harder than the 7 years before," Vanessa later said. "To know answers were finally coming, but not yet knowing what they were. It was like being suspended between two worlds." On the morning of March 7th, Bryce arrived with his attorney, looking noticeably aged beyond his 42 years. As recording equipment was activated and formal introductions made, the weight of the moment settled over the room. 7 years of silence were about to end. "Mr. Blackwood," Sutton began, "please tell us what happened to your nephew, Tyler." Bryce's hands trembled slightly as he took a sip of water. "I didn't know what Garrett had done when he called me that night," he started. "I swear I didn't know. He just said he needed help with something terrible." What followed was a 4-hour statement that would permanently alter the course of the investigation and finally answer the question that had haunted Denver for 7 years. What happened to baby Tyler Blackwood? As March 2016 unfolded, the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with increasing speed. The wall of silence that had protected the truth was crumbling, revealing a tragedy born not of malice, but of panic, poor decisions, and misplaced loyalty. For Detective Sutton, the case was approaching its resolution. For Vanessa, the prospect of finally knowing her son's fate carried both relief and dread. And for Garrett Blackwood, the reckoning he had evaded for 7 years was finally at hand. The stark fluorescent lights of the Denver District Attorney's interview room cast harsh shadows across Bryce Blackwood's face as he began his confession on that cold March morning. For 7 years he had carried the weight of that night, a burden that had slowly crushed his spirit and consumed his life. "I've played that night over in my head 1,000 times, Bryce began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I think about what I could have done differently, what I should have done differently." Detective Sutton remained silent, allowing him the space to unfold his story without interruption. Experience had taught her that such moments were fragile. A poorly timed question could fracture the narrative flow and give a reluctant witness reason to retreat. "Garrett called me around 1:30 in the morning," Bryce continued. "He was frantic, not making much sense. All I could understand was that something had happened to Tyler, and he needed me to come over right away. He specifically told me not to call him back, to just come to the house and enter through the basement door." The transcript of Bryce's statement revealed a nightmarish scenario. When he arrived at his brother's home, Garrett was pacing in the basement, visibly intoxicated and in a state of panic. On the basement couch lay Tyler, unmoving. "I knew immediately something was terribly wrong," Bryce recounted, his voice breaking. "The baby was so still. When I asked Garrett what happened, he just kept saying, 'It was an accident, I just looked away for a minute.' He told me Tyler had been fussy, wouldn't stop crying. Garrett had been drinking heavily, I could smell it on him, and he'd taken Tyler downstairs to let Vanessa sleep." According to Bryce's account, Garrett had placed Tyler on the couch while he mixed a bottle in the basement kitchenette. When he returned, he found the baby had rolled off and wasn't breathing. In his panic and intoxicated state, Garrett attempted CPR but was unsuccessful. "By the time I got there, Tyler had been dead for at least an hour," Bryce stated. Garrett was beside himself, saying his life was over, that they'd charge him with murder because he'd been drinking while responsible for the baby. He begged me to help him. District Attorney Mendez, who observed the interview, later described this as the critical juncture where tragedy transformed into criminal conspiracy. In that moment, Bryce made a decision that would define the next 7 years of both brothers' lives. Rather than calling 911, he agreed to help Garrett conceal what had happened. The brothers wrapped Tyler's body in his light blue blanket and placed him in a storage container from the basement. They loaded it into Bryce's truck and drove west into the mountains, eventually finding a remote location in what Bryce now identified as Pike National Forest, approximately 2 hours from Denver. "We buried him beneath a large boulder that took both of us to move slightly," Bryce explained. "Garrett kept the blanket. I didn't know why at the time. We agreed on a story. Tyler was in his crib when Garrett checked on him at midnight and was discovered missing by Vanessa in the morning. We thought it would look like an abduction." After returning to Denver before dawn, Garrett disposed of the blanket in a dumpster behind a shopping center miles from their home. Bryce went home to shower and destroy the clothes he'd worn. By the time Vanessa discovered the empty crib at 6:30 a.m., both brothers had established their alibis and committed to their deception. "The hardest part was watching Vanessa suffer," Bryce admitted, tears finally breaking through his composure. "Watching her search and hope year after year. I wanted to tell her so many times, but Garrett insisted we'd both go to prison. He convinced me we were too deep in the lie to ever get out." As the interview continued, Bryce revealed the toll their secret had taken. His marriage had ended within a year. He'd moved to Wyoming to escape the memories and Denver's annual media coverage of the case. The clearing in Medicine Bow Forest wasn't Tyler's burial site, but a place of personal penance, somewhere Bryce went monthly to reflect on his role in the tragedy. "I sold my truck because a neighbor had seen it at Garrett's house that night. I was paranoid someone would connect it to us," he explained. "The cash withdrawal was because I thought we might need to run if the police got close to the truth. But as months passed and the case went cold, we settled into the lie. It became our reality." When asked why he had finally decided to come forward, Bryce's answer was unexpectedly simple. "I'm tired. 7 years of looking over my shoulder, of jumping every time the phone rings. 7 years of watching Vanessa's life shattered while Garrett moved on. I couldn't do it anymore." By mid-afternoon, the interview had yielded not just a confession, but actionable information. Bryce provided detailed directions to Tyler's burial site and agreed to lead investigators there the following day. He also surrendered his phone, containing recent text exchanges with Garrett that corroborated elements of his account. District Attorney Mendez immediately secured arrest warrants for both brothers, Bryce for accessory after the fact and evidence tampering, Garrett for involuntary manslaughter, child endangerment, and obstruction of justice. While Bryce remained in custody, a tactical team apprehended Garrett at his apartment that evening. "He seemed almost relieved when we arrived," recalled Sergeant Thomas Reed, who led the arrest team. "Like he'd been waiting for this moment for years. The only thing he asked was whether his brother had finally talked." The following morning, as promised, Bryce led investigators to Tyler's burial site. The scene was somber, as forensic teams carefully removed the boulder and began the painstaking process of excavation. After several hours, they recovered a small set of remains, along with fragments of a plastic storage container that had partially decomposed over the years. "It was a moment of profound sadness, but also closure," Sutton later reflected. "After 7 years of searching, we had finally found Tyler and could bring him home to his mother." While the recovery operation continued, Garrett Blackwood was undergoing his initial interrogation. Unlike his brother, he initially maintained his innocence, clinging to the abduction story they had fabricated 7 years earlier. When informed of Bryce's detailed confession, however, his resolve crumbled. "You don't understand what it's like," he told investigators, "to make one mistake and have your entire life defined by it. I never meant to hurt Tyler. I loved my son." Over the next 6 hours, Garrett provided his own account of that night, largely corroborating Bryce's version with one significant difference. He claimed Tyler's death was completely accidental, the result of the fall from the couch while he was momentarily distracted. "The medical examiner will determine cause of death," District Attorney Mendez told reporters at a brief press conference that evening. "What's clear is that regardless of how Tyler died, the decision to conceal his death and fabricate an abduction caused immeasurable pain to his mother and this community. That deception will have consequences." News of the breakthrough spread quickly through Denver. Media outlets that had long since relegated Tyler's case to occasional mentions now led their broadcasts with the developments. For many residents who had participated in searches years earlier, the resolution brought a complex mixture of relief and sorrow. For Vanessa Blackwood, the news came directly from Detective Sutton, who drove to her home personally to share the findings before they became public. "I always knew," Vanessa said after learning the truth. "Not the details, but in my heart, I knew Garrett was involved. A mother senses these things. What I never imagined was that they would let me search for 7 years knowing all along." The preliminary forensic examination confirmed the remains were Tyler's through DNA matching. The medical examiner's initial assessment indicated a skull fracture consistent with a fall, though determining the exact circumstances would be challenging given the condition of the remains. As March progressed, both brothers remained in custody, awaiting formal charges. Bryce, having cooperated fully, was expected to receive consideration for his testimony against Garrett. The district attorney's office focused on building their case methodically, knowing the high-profile nature of the proceedings would bring intense scrutiny. On March 28, 2016, exactly 7 years and 16 days after Tyler's disappearance, formal charges were filed. Garrett faced counts of involuntary manslaughter, child endangerment resulting in death, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. Bryce was charged with accessory after the fact and evidence tampering, with prosecutors recommending reduced charges in exchange for his continued cooperation. The preliminary hearing was set for April, with both brothers remanded to custody without bail. As the legal process began its deliberate progression, the community that had searched for Tyler 7 years earlier now prepared to see justice finally served. For Detective Sutton, the case represented both professional validation and emotional catharsis. "Cold cases stay with you," she reflected. You carry the victims with you, especially the children. Finding Tyler doesn't erase the tragedy of his death, but it does bring a measure of peace to his mother, to the community, and to those of us who never stopped looking for him." As March turned to April, Denver began the process of coming to terms with the truth about Tyler Blackwood, a truth far different from the abduction scenario that had haunted the city for 7 years. The next phase would move from investigation to judicial proceedings, as the full extent of the brothers' actions and their legal consequences would be determined in the courtroom. The Denver County Courthouse stood as a monument to justice, its sandstone facade and imposing columns projecting permanence and authority in a world often lacking both. On the morning of September 12, 2016, 6 months after the Blackwood brothers' arrests, the building's steps teemed with media representatives and spectators gathered for the commencement of Garrett Blackwood's trial. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was charged with a solemn tension. Judge Eleanor Walters, known for her no-nonsense approach and meticulous attention to detail, had been assigned to preside over what had become one of Colorado's most closely watched cases in recent memory. The courtroom was completely silent when Vanessa entered, recalled court reporter Samuel Chen. She walked with remarkable composure, her head high, her gaze fixed forward. Everyone present understood they were witnessing extraordinary strength. Vanessa had spent the previous months preparing for this moment with the support of victim advocates and her fiancé, Michael Delaney. She had also made the difficult decision to attend the entire trial, determined to hear every detail about her son's final hours. "I owed it to Tyler," she later explained. "For 7 years, I imagined countless scenarios about what happened to him. No matter how painful the truth, it couldn't be worse than the torment of not knowing." District Attorney Caroline Mendez had assembled a formidable prosecution team led by veteran prosecutor Jonathan Hayes. Their strategy was to present a comprehensive narrative of Tyler's death and the elaborate deception that followed, emphasizing the calculated nature of the brothers' actions and the prolonged suffering their lies had caused. The state intends to prove not just that Garrett Blackwood's negligence resulted in his son's death, Hayes stated in his opening remarks, but that his subsequent actions demonstrated a callous disregard for both the dignity of his child and the emotional well-being of Tyler's mother. This case is about more than a tragic accident. It's about the deliberate choice to conceal that tragedy through years of deception. Defense attorney Marcus Sullivan presented a contrasting narrative, portraying Garrett as a panicked father who made a catastrophic error in judgment while intoxicated. "My client made terrible mistakes," Sullivan acknowledged to the jury. "He will carry the weight of those mistakes for the rest of his life. But I urge you to distinguish between poor decisions made in moments of extreme distress and the kind of malicious intent the prosecution suggests." The trial's first week focused on establishing the timeline of events. On March 11-12, 2009, forensic experts testified about the cell tower data, placing both brothers on the route to Pike National Forest. Former neighbors recounted the commotion surrounding Tyler's reported disappearance, including Eleanor Winter's observation of Bryce's truck in the driveway hours before the alarm was raised. The prosecution's most powerful testimony came from Detective Meredith Sutton, who methodically walked the jury through the 7-year investigation, highlighting the brothers' numerous contradictions and deliberate misdirections. Her testimony, delivered with clinical precision, transformed what might have seemed like isolated discrepancies into a damning pattern of deception. Detective Sutton's presentation was masterful, legal analyst Patricia Hammond commented during a media briefing. She connected dots across 7 years of evidence, creating a comprehensive picture of obstruction that left little room for alternative interpretations. As the second week began, medical examiner Dr. Kenji Tanaka presented findings from Tyler's autopsy. The remains, though significantly decomposed, revealed a fracture to the occipital bone consistent with impact against a hard surface. Toxicology could not determine whether Tyler had been exposed to alcohol through Garrett's handling, given the condition of the remains. The injury is consistent with the account of a fall from a couch onto a concrete basement floor, Dr. Tanaka testified. Such an impact could certainly cause fatal trauma in an infant. However, I cannot rule out the possibility of additional factors contributing to death, including potential positional asphyxia if the child was improperly positioned after the fall. This testimony created a critical opening for the defense, who seized upon the medical examiner's measured uncertainty to suggest that Tyler's death might have been survivable had Garrett sought immediate medical attention rather than panicking. Would prompt medical intervention have potentially saved Tyler's life? Sullivan asked during cross-examination. It's impossible to state with certainty, Dr. Tanaka responded. However, immediate medical attention is always the recommended course of action for head trauma, particularly in infants. This exchange highlighted the central tragedy of the case, that a moment's poor judgment had potentially transformed an accident into a fatality, compounded by years of deliberate concealment. The trial's emotional center arrived in its third week, with Bryce Blackwood's testimony. Having accepted a plea agreement in exchange for his cooperation, Bryce appeared in court wearing prison attire, his expression a mask of resignation. For nearly 6 hours over 2 days, he detailed the events of that March night and the subsequent years of deception. His testimony was frequently interrupted by his own emotional breakdowns, particularly when describing the burial site and his monthly pilgrimages to Medicine Bow Forest as acts of private penance. I knew what we did was wrong, Bryce testified, his voice barely audible at times. Every day for 7 years, I woke up thinking this would be the day I'd finally tell the truth. But each day the fear of consequences grew stronger than the weight of guilt. When asked why he had finally come forward, Bryce's answer resonated throughout the courtroom. Because Tyler deserved better. Because Vanessa deserved answers. Because the truth, however painful, is less destructive than a lie. As Bryce stepped down from the witness stand, his eyes briefly met Vanessa's. No words were exchanged, but observers noted the complexity of that momentary connection, acknowledgement of a shared loss, however differently experienced. The defense team worked diligently to portray Garrett sympathetically, calling character witnesses who described him as a loving father before Tyler's death. Former colleagues testified about his deteriorating mental state in the years following, painting a picture of a man haunted by his actions. Psychological expert Dr. Rebecca Foster provided context for Garrett's behavior, explaining how trauma and guilt can distort decision-making. What we see here is consistent with trauma-induced cognitive distortion, where an initial poor decision creates a cascading effect. Each lie requires another to maintain the facade, until the individual becomes trapped in an alternative reality they've constructed. As the trial entered its final week, speculation mounted about whether Garrett would testify in his own defense. The decision, fraught with legal risk, was announced on the trial's 17th day. He would take the stand. Garrett's testimony proved to be the trial's most dramatic chapter. Gone was the composed man who had maintained his innocence for 7 years. In his place sat someone visibly broken, his voice frequently faltering as he recounted the night of Tyler's death. "I'd been drinking heavily that evening," he admitted. "Vanessa and I had argued about finances, and after she went to bed, I took Tyler downstairs so his crying wouldn't wake her. I was mixing his formula when my phone buzzed. I just looked away for a moment. He described finding Tyler on the floor, unresponsive, and his increasingly desperate attempts at resuscitation. I knew I'd messed up. I was drunk and responsible for my son's death. I couldn't face Vanessa, couldn't face what I'd done, so I called the only person I thought would help me. Under cross-examination, Prosecutor Hayes methodically dismantled Garrett's portrayal of events as a panic-driven mistake. He established that over an hour passed between Tyler's fall and Garrett's call to Bryce, time during which medical intervention might have been life-saving. He highlighted the elaborate nature of their subsequent deception, including Garrett's performance for the media and his willingness to watch Vanessa suffer for years. "You stood beside your wife at press conferences," Hayes pressed. "You watched her plead for information about your son, knowing exactly what had happened to him. Did you ever in 7 years consider ending her torment by telling the truth?" Garrett's response, "I couldn't bear to lose her too," echoed hollowly through the courtroom. On October 7, 2016, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Garrett Blackwood was found guilty on all counts: involuntary manslaughter, child endangerment resulting in death, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Vanessa delivered a victim impact statement that observers described as both devastating and dignified. She spoke not of hatred, but of incomprehensible loss. The milestones never witnessed, the life never lived, the 7 years spent searching for a child who would never come home. "Tyler would be 8 years old now," she said, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "He would be in 3rd grade. I'll never know if he would have loved baseball or dinosaurs or space. I'll never hear his laugh or help with his homework or watch him grow into the person he was meant to be." Garrett took all of that from Tyler, and he took it from me. On October 21, 2016, Judge Walters delivered her sentence. Garrett received 12 years for involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment, with additional consecutive sentences for the remaining charges, totaling 18 years. Bryce, having fulfilled his cooperation agreement, received 5 years for accessory after the fact, with eligibility for parole after serving half his sentence. As the courthouse emptied that afternoon, Denver began the process of reconciling with a case that had haunted the community for over 7 years. Tyler Blackwood, once a missing child whose image had appeared on countless flyers and news reports, had finally received a measure of justice. In November 2016, Tyler was laid to rest in a private ceremony, attended by family and the investigators who had never abandoned his case. Detective Sutton, who had been instrumental in finally uncovering the truth, placed a small teddy bear beside the tiny casket, a gesture of farewell to the child who had occupied her professional life and personal thoughts for nearly 2 years.